betrayal isn't loud. It doesn't come with warning signs or dramatic music. It slips in quietly, taking its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when it does, it doesn't just break you, it reshapes you. The day had been like any other. Mason drove home in his rusted pickup, hands stiff from gripping tools all day, arms sore from lifting heavy equipment. He was 36, but lately he felt twice that. Construction work had a way of grinding a man down, taking a little more from him each day. He pulled into the driveway of his house, a modest two-bedroom in the outskirts of Kansas City. Something felt off before he even stepped inside. It wasn't anything obvious, just a small detail. Her car wasn't there. Natalie had been distant for months, always finding reasons to stay out longer, always on her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The excuses had started piling up, but Mason had ignored them, too tired to question what he didn't want to know. The house was silent when he stepped inside, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He set his lunchbox on the counter, reached for a beer, and then, he saw it. Natalie's phone. Unlocked. Sitting on the counter, screen still glowing. Mason had never been the kind of man to snoop. He believed in trust, in giving people the space they needed. But something about the way the phone just sat there, waiting, made his fingers twitch. A message had just come in. A group chat. Weekend plans, 2 hearts. His pulse slowed. It wasn't guilt he felt as he swiped open the message, it was inevitability. The screen lit up with a photo. Natalie, beaming, leaning into a frame. But Mason's eyes weren't on her smile. They were on the hand resting possessively on her hip. He knew that hand. Ryan. His brother. A familiar weight settled in his chest, a slow, crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. His mind raced, trying to piece together a timeline, but the reality was simple. This had been happening for a while. Mason scrolled through the messages, each one carving deeper into his ribs. Natalie, miss you already. Ryan, me too, babe. This weekend was perfect. Can't wait to see you again. Natalie, Mason works so much, he doesn't even notice when I'm gone. LOL. His grip tightened around the phone. There it was. The proof. Not just of the affair, but of something worse. They thought he was too stupid to see it. The sound of tires on gravel yanked him from his daze. Natalie was home. His hands moved before his mind could catch up. He locked the phone, placed it back on the counter exactly as he found it, and turned on his heel. His legs carried him toward the garage, his breath even but sharp. The second the door shut behind him, he reached for the first thing in sight, a wrench. The cool metal was solid in his grip, grounding him, keeping his rage from spiraling out of control. The front door creaked open. He could hear her moving through the house, keys dropping onto the table, the rustle of her jacket being tossed aside. She had no idea. She had no idea that the man she betrayed wasn't the same one standing in the garage now. Mason stared down at his reflection in the metal of the wrench, jaw tight, heartbeat steady. He wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Not until he had a plan. Because Natalie and Ryan weren't just going to get away with this. They were going to pay. And when he was finished, either of them would even see it coming. Rage is easy. It demands action, begs for destruction. But control, that's where the real power lies. Mason didn't need to scream or throw things. He didn't need a confrontation. He needed a plan. The next morning, he was out the door before Natalie even stirred. The thought of sitting across from her at breakfast, pretending nothing had changed, was unbearable. Instead, he let the familiar hum of his truck and the weight of the morning air settle over him as he drove toward the construction site. Work had always been his escape. The relentless noise, the physical strain, the sheer exhaustion, usually, it was enough to keep his mind from wandering. But today, none of it touched him. His body moved on instinct, lifting, measuring, hammering, while his thoughts sharpened into something else entirely. By mid-morning, a conversation near the break area caught his attention. A few workers stood huddled together, voices hushed but urgent. He caught bits and pieces. Another site had been hit. It was the third time this month. Expensive tools and machinery, gone without a trace. No signs of forced entry, no security footage. Just missing equipment and frustrated foremen. Mason barely registered the words until a thought slid into his mind, quiet but undeniable. If someone was already stealing from these job sites, then maybe, just maybe, someone else could take the fall. The idea lingered, growing roots. It was reckless. Risky. But Mike had taken something from him, something irreplaceable. It was only fair that Mason returned the favor. By the time the shift ended, the idea had settled into certainty. That night, he didn't go straight home. Instead, he found himself parked outside a bar he hadn't stepped into in years, the Ironclad. It was the kind of place where men talked in half-truths, where money and silence had more value than trust. Mason scanned the room, his gaze settling on a familiar figure slouched over a drink. Derek, an old name from a life he had left behind. They weren't friends. They had worked together once, years ago, before Mason pulled himself out of that world. But Derek had never left. The conversation started slow, old memories and casual words. Mason played his part well, just a guy looking for a little extra cash, interested in opportunities. It didn't take long for Derek to confirm what Mason already suspected. The thefts weren't random. Someone on the inside was running things, moving stolen equipment through the right channels, making sure it all disappeared without a trace. The police had no leads, no suspects. It was perfect. Mason made sure to leave with just enough information, a name, a contact, a window into a world he needed to step into. As he walked out into the cold night air, he felt something new settle in his chest. This wasn't just about getting even. This was about taking control. And by the time he was finished, neither Natalie nor Ryan would have anything left. Revenge wasn't a single action, it was a slow, careful process. Mason knew that if he wanted to do this right, he couldn't act out of anger. He had to be patient. Precise. Days passed, but the fire inside him never dimmed. It only grew sharper. By day, he was the same man he had always been, the quiet, hard-working guy at the construction site, keeping his head down and his hands busy. But at night, he was something else entirely. Every spare moment was spent gathering information, weaving the pieces of his plan together. He watched. He listened. He followed patterns. Natalie made it easy. She thought she was careful, but she wasn't. Every Tuesday and Thursday, her car disappeared for hours. An hour later, Ryan's black Dodge Charger would pull into the parking lot of the Evergreen Lodge, a rundown motel on the edge of town. The first time Mason followed them, he sat in his truck across the street, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, watching through the windshield as they walked inside. Seeing them together, laughing, their hands casually brushing against each other, it was like a fresh wound being ripped open. But he didn't move. He didn't storm inside or cause a scene. That wasn't his plan. Instead, he took pictures. Not to expose them. Not to confront them. Just for himself. A reminder. While they carried on with their secret meetings, Mason was unraveling Ryan's life from the inside. He had already broken into Ryan's apartment once before, a test run, just to see if he could. It had been too easy. Ryan had always been careless, leaving things unlocked, never taking precautions. This time, Mason went back with purpose. A few well-placed hidden cameras. A careful scan through the piles of paperwork scattered across the desk. What he found was even better than he had hoped. Ryan wasn't just a liar. He was a criminal. Stacks of financial records, transactions that didn't add up. False invoices. Tax fraud. Mason took photos of everything. Every document, every bank statement. He backed up files onto a burner laptop, making sure that no matter what happened, he had enough evidence to bury Ryan completely. And while his plan for Ryan was coming together, so was his plan at the construction site. Derek had introduced him to Leon, a man who specialized in moving stolen goods. He was older, polished, the kind of guy who never said more than necessary. Mason played his role carefully, just another guy looking for a way to make quick money. But in reality, he was leading them exactly where he wanted them to go. The police were already closing in. It was only a matter of time before they started looking for suspects. And when they did, Ryan's name would be the first one they found. At home, Natalie started to notice the shift. She moved differently, more careful around Mason, as if she sensed something was off. The excuses became longer, the lies weaker. She had no idea what was coming. And that made it all the more satisfying. A good trap isn't just about catching the target, it's about making them believe they walked into it on their own. Mason had spent weeks setting the stage, carefully placing every piece exactly where it needed to be. Now, it was time to close the doors. Natalie had started acting differently. Whether it was guilt or suspicion, Mason didn't know, and he didn't care. She had begun staying home more, watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, speaking softer, as if she were testing the waters. He didn't push her away. That wasn't part of the plan. He played along, pretending nothing had changed, pretending he didn't know exactly where she had been every Tuesday and Thursday night. One evening, after dinner, she hesitated in the kitchen, running her fingers along the rim of her wine glass. Her voice was careful, testing. She suggested that maybe they needed time together, that they had drifted apart. Maybe they should take a weekend away, just the two of them. Mason almost laughed. She thought she was still in control. So he agreed. Enthusiastically. He told her about a place up in the mountains, a small, secluded cabin he had found. No cell service, no distractions. Just them. She smiled, relief washing over her face, and for a second, Mason almost felt something familiar. A flicker of the past, of who they had been. But the past was dead. While Natalie believed she was fixing things, Mason was making his final moves. That same night, he slipped out after she had fallen asleep, heading straight for the construction site. By now, he had learned the security patterns, memorized the shifts, understood exactly where to move without being seen. He had stolen nothing in all these weeks, had never touched a thing. But tonight he did. It was quick, practiced. A few high-value tools, easy to carry, easy to disappear. But Mason wasn't keeping them. Instead, he planted them. He knew exactly where Ryan kept his spare car keys. Knew exactly how careless he was with his apartment security. It took less than 15 minutes. By the time Mason walked out, Ryan was a thief. Evidence carefully placed. A direct link to the job site. A few incriminating texts, sent from an anonymous number to a burner phone. Hints, suggestions, enough to spark suspicion if anyone started digging. And they would start digging. The next morning, as Mason sipped his coffee, he turned on the news. A report flashed across the screen. Police investigating a string of construction site thefts, new leads emerging. Perfect. He could already picture how it would play out. The police would begin tracing stolen items, checking known associates, looking for financial irregularities. And Ryan? Ryan's entire life was a financial irregularity. It wouldn't take long before someone connected the dots. Natalie, oblivious to the news tightening around them, hummed as she packed for their trip. She kissed Mason's cheek before leaving to run errands, the warmth in the gesture so false it almost made him sick. The weekend was set. A trip to the mountains. No phone service. No distractions. Just them. And when they returned? Ryan's world would already be burning. There was something poetic about watching a fire burn when you were the one who lit the match. Mason had spent weeks setting everything in motion, and now, all he had to do was sit back and let the flames consume everything. The drive up to the cabin was silent. Natalie, oblivious to what was happening behind the scenes, kept glancing at him, like she was searching for something, some reassurance, some sign that they were okay. Mason gave her what she wanted. He played the part perfectly. Smiled in all the right places. Answered her small talk with just enough warmth to make her believe in the lie. The cabin was exactly as he described, secluded, peaceful, a perfect place to be alone. They unpacked, settled in, made dinner. Natalie was softer than she had been in months, the weight of guilt turning into some desperate attempt to fix something that was already beyond repair. Mason let her. He let her hold his hand, let her laugh at old memories, let her believe for just a little while longer. That night, as the fire crackled in the stone hearth, he poured 2 drinks. Hers, laced with a sedative strong enough to keep her asleep until morning. By the time the glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the wooden floor, Mason was already out the door. The drive back down the mountain was quick. He knew exactly where he was going. Ryan's apartment. By now, things were already spiraling for his dear brother. The police had started sniffing around, investigating the stolen equipment, following the breadcrumbs Mason had carefully laid out. Bank records were being pulled, financial transactions scrutinized. It wouldn't be long before Ryan realized just how deep in trouble he was. Mason let himself in, moving through the darkened apartment like a ghost. He wasn't there for more evidence. He was there for one last push. He picked up Ryan's phone, typed out a message. A meeting. A location. An urgent tone that would make him panic. He hit send. Then he left. Ryan, scrambling for answers, would show up. The police, already watching him, would follow. And when they did, they would have everything they needed. By the time Mason returned to the cabin, Natalie was still asleep, exactly as he had left her. He sat by the window, watching the skies shift from black to deep gray, waiting for the sun to rise on the aftermath of everything he had done. By noon, Natalie's phone was ringing nonstop. Ryan had been arrested. Fraud. Theft. Multiple charges. The weight of it all crashed down at once, and Mason watched as her world crumbled in real time. She gasped, covered her mouth, paced the wooden floor in disbelief. She turned to Mason, searching for comfort, for an answer. He just looked at her. Expression blank. Empty. And in that moment she knew. She didn't say anything, but the way her face strained of color, the way her hands trembled at her sides, she understood. Mason had won. The drive home was different. Silent. Heavy. Natalie didn't reach for his hand this time. She just stared out the window, lost in the wreckage of what she had helped create. By the time they pulled into the driveway, she was still holding on to some sliver of denial, still clinging to the idea that maybe things could be repaired. Mason didn't bother breaking the illusion. He simply walked inside, poured himself a drink, and waited for the moment she would finally realize she had lost everything. The news broke the next day. Ryan's trial was going to be messy, long, and impossible to escape from. His financial dealings, his connection to the thefts, every piece had fallen exactly as Mason intended. Natalie didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. A week later she packed her bags. She didn't say goodbye. She just left. Mason didn't watch her go. He sat in his chair, whiskey in hand, staring at the cold embers in the fireplace, feeling nothing. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Just the weight of silence. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had burned too much.